Hello Internet, I'm back. This is a little weird for me. I'm doing a build bio. It's not a Honda. And I'm relatively clean shaven. And I also don't have a red cup in my hand because I'm very nervous about our next guest. He's a huge, huge icon to me and to many others as well. So I'm trying to play it straight today. Rod Emory.
How you doing, John?
What did you bring? Oh my goodness.
You know, brought a crazy little 356 to share with you.
Could you, in the tightest way possible, tell everybody about how we came to this nutty 356 here and what the path that brought you here?
I've been building and restoring Porsche's vintage race cars for about 30 years. I'm 45, did my first car when I was 14 years old. My grandfather, Neil Emory, had a shop, Valley Custom Shop in Burbank, dating back to 46, 47. In fact, he helped Alex Exidius build the first belly tanker streamliner that SoCal Speed Shop had, and then built the envelope body for the first hot rod over 200 miles an hour. He ran Valley Custom Shop up until 61, and then a good friend of his, Chick Iverson, who had a used car lot, bought the Porsche Volkswagen dealership in Newport Beach and needed a body guy to come and fix all the old Porsches that were getting cracked up. That's where my family ended up from, traditional hot rods, custom cars into the Porsche world. A few years later, I was born into this family of, Porsche, craftsmen, parts guys, always doing crazy stuff. Yeah, so for 30 years, I've been building and restoring and racing 356s and continuing to kind of push the envelope and evolve the platform and the chassis. I've built about 170 cars over the last 30 years. A lot of vintage race cars, a lot of what I call, outlaws and specials. In my style, because I always like to use as many factory Porsche parts. I don't want to put a 356 body on a Bronco. We really wanted to kind of create a car that was inspired by the 935 and some of the early RSR cars, and kind of taking a 356 and bringing it a little bit more into the future, but still keeping it very old school and retro and fun.
Did this car start as a design sketch that you just drew something and you posted on your Instagram account and said, yo, I would really like to build something like this, and our boy Enrique Cisneros saw that, and is that how it sort of went?
Yeah, I mean, that's how it came together. I've always had the kind of idea of really hot rodding out a 356 and doing it more 935 style, and then a young guy, Greg Macy, that lives up in McMinnville, Oregon, took that idea and sketched up this cool kind of over-the-top 356 with, flares and, wacky stuff hanging all over it. And then Mark from Illis reached out to Enrique and said, hey, have you checked this thing out? Have you seen, this crazy, wacky 356 that Emory's playing around with? And Enrique says, man, he calls me up and he says, Rod, he goes, are you going to build that thing? And I said, well, someday if the right person comes along. And he says, let's make it happen. Enrique says to me, he goes, then pick something that will inspire this entire build. Is there something in Momo, in the history of Momo and dating back to the early race days that would inspire this build? I said, well, my favorite wheel of all time was the 5-spoke wheel that Momo built for the 935s and some of the early Group C cars like 956, 962s, which was a big center lock, 5-spoke wheel. It's a wheel that has just always kind of struck a chord in me. And so he says, well, let's build on that. Let's go ahead and make the body removable, make it all out of aluminum. So all the removable panels on the car, there's no fiberglass. It's all hand-formed aluminum panels that cam lock off the car with hand-hammered louvers throughout the exterior, both on the deck lid and on the front fenders. And then on the front of the car, we really, we needed plenty of air movement. So, big oil cooler in the front. So it's got an oil cooler inlet and then exit, coming through the hood. And you'll see little pops of, amber fiberglass, both in the air scoops on the rear of the car, this oil cooler scoop up in the front, as well as the dash and engine compartment. And that amber fiberglass really ties back to the early prototype days of Porsche. That's kind of the coolness before carbon fiber. I wanted a little bit of a flare. You can see that the fender actually has the exit air right in front of the door. So we pulled the fender out a little bit and brought this exit air vent out there. On the flares, I just wanted enough to give it a little bit of detail and to accomplish the tire cover, but not be so aggressive and over the top that it started to look planted on too much.
Now, the donor car It's a barn find, as in keeping with most of yours. This is a 1960 356B. This is B?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
It was a yellow, rusted out 1960B that we found up in Oregon. Floors were gone, longitudinals were gone, the tunnel was wasted. So it was the perfect candidate for this type of a build. The roof was still in perfect shape, the dash, the door jambs, all of that. The areas that we were going to cut out to do the 964 integration, those were all wasted anyway, so it didn't really, it didn't really matter. The metal we were cutting out, we were throwing away anyways. So instead of putting in factory 356 sheet metal, we just used later 964 stuff.
Hear that, purists? It's not the worst thing. This is not the worst thing. When we talk about purists, now you talked about outlaws and specials. Would you call this an outlaw, or is this one of your specials?
This is what I call an RS. It's a little bit more race inspired.
Okay.
My outlaw cars, the bodies are all virtually stock, but all the performance and everything underneath. The specials are where I evolve the design. This car and the all-wheel drive car and some of the other ones that we're doing, the RS cars, they're really more about what's underneath that make the difference. This particular one we call the 356 RSR just because it's really a little bit over the top for a 356.
So you would say that essentially your outlaw cars don't really play by the rules. I'd say your special cars rewrite the rules, and then this new line of RS cars you do kind of do a burnout on the rules as they're leaving the paddock? Is that what
Pretty much,
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
They definitely just slaughter the rules. But the 935 was a 911 that was built with twin turbos, fiberglass panels, all removable, massive intercoolers, but you could still see the tail panel of the 911 and the tail lights poking in behind. So this car is kind of like the 356 version of that, in my opinion. Turbos are exposed, part of the tail panel still there, tail lights are there, but you've got all this bodywork around it that encloses the intercoolers and the wheels and air intake and all that other stuff.
Can we get inside it?
Yeah.
Look at these door handles. I mean, everything.
As we 3D scanned those, we machined them, we took material out of the middle and then did aluminum door handles for it. So, lighten things up wherever we can. Yeah, I mean, when you look at the inside, it's still fundamentally 356. The threshold, the rocker, the dash, the roof, door jambs, all that stuff are all 356. The doors, got rid of inside door handles, did the old RS type, leather strap. We did seats that are the old RSR style bucket seats. And
feels very 917 layback style.
Yeah, an amber fiberglass, and then did it in this Nomex 908 style felt, just like Porsche used in the 917s and 908s. A little bit of amber fiberglass, on the floor, just like the pedal boards in a 917 or 935. Amber fiberglass dash. The coolest part of this thing, I think, on the inside is the controls. So obviously, this being built for Enrique at Momo, we're going to use my favorite Momo steering wheel, which is the distressed Prototipo wheel with removable hub, and then we used a Roth Sport shift lever with the Momo knob that's kind of a tribute knob to the old 917 knob. But if you look on the dash, there's this big, gnarly, knurled knob sitting there. So that's a 935 boost control knob. Those of you turbo guys, obviously you know what that is, but that controls the amount of boost that the engine is producing. And we operate this thing at somewhere between 0.9 and 1.2. And that big knurled knob just lets me kind of dial that in with a gauge right next to it.
And is Momo re-releasing this wheel? Is that a thing now?
Yeah, so this Prototipo wheel is released now. So, this wheel was used back in the day on RSRs and lots of 911 stuff. Now this is a new release distressed wheel that they have. And then if you look at the gauges on the car, we've got a 904 style combination gauge that gives us fuel level, oil pressure, oil temperature, and obviously our tach, speedo, all the necessary gauges that we need, nothing overkill, but still very 356 and period. Pedals, we went with a tilt and pedal assembly. Let's make it a little more adjustable with a balance bar and independent master cylinders, and Momo has some really great pedal pads that adapt right to that tilt and pedal assembly. So for harnesses in the car, this is the new Momo 6-point harness set that I'm using in some of my race cars. What I love about these belts is, we all fight with pull downs and kind of the release, and these have such an amazing mechanism for tightening. They're just probably the most user-friendly belts that I've ever used, and the styling is great. Something else that's kind of cool in here is I didn't want the car to be totally sparse interior because it's going to be driven. So I kind of dug back deep into the vintage Porsche heritage And what Porsche used on their old GT cars, it's kind of a pebbly, rubbery vinyl material called Hardua. It also looks like something that you'd see in a taxi cab, but because somebody might be throwing up on it and you can rinse it out.
Probably me.
But it's perfect for this thing because if you can see that back here, a piece that covers up the Motec and everything, but it has this little bit of kind of insulation or backing to it as well. So it really does a great job just deadening the sound, but it's not too heavy. So I didn't have to go and put sound deadening throughout the car. I just painted the whole thing, top coated that with Rust-Oleum industrial enamel, and we were able to just glue this Hardua right over the top of it. I don't want a car that's gonna rattle the skull off of my clients and make it so they only want to drive them for 15 minutes and then park them. I'd rather build a car, even if I have to add 15 or 20 pounds for a little headliner and a little bit of interior, so that it makes it drivable for them and enjoyable.
Excellent. Speaking of sound, can we figure out how this thing makes so much sound? Now you talk about this being a 964 based engine, which means it's a single overhead cam. It's not necessarily the push rod, but I don't think this is a 6-cylinder.
If you go back into Porsche's history, the early cars dating back to 1948 were a VW type engine. I mean, Porsche developed the Volkswagen and the engine and everything there. So when they built their own car, it was an evolved VW engine. It was a pushrod originally 1100 cc and then eventually became a 1600 cc pushrod engine, which meant the cam was in the middle, push rods to activate the valve train. Fast forward to the 60s and they were developing their 6-cylinder, which is a single overhead cam. It's actually got 2 cams, one on the right, one on the left. And in the 80s, there was a guy, Chuck Beck, who built the Beck 550 Spider and Beck Speedsters. Chuck Beck took a 911 engine, whacked the center 2 cylinders out of it, welded the case back together, and then built this 4-cylinder version of a 911. Right after that, a guy, Dean Palopoulos, did the same thing out of a turbo case. So that's when the concept actually became a viable part that was put into cars. I got together with Jeff Gamroth at Roth Sport Racing up in Tualatin, Oregon, who's really one of the best, most well-known engine builders. He builds the engines for guys like Gunther Works. So Gunther Works cars all have a Roth Sport engine. Also Joey Seeley that has Emotion.
Yep.
The Safari cars that he's built, those both have Roth Sport engines. And so when I wanted to build this 4-cylinder 911 and have our own version, I got together with Jeff and I said, let's build it off of the 964 architecture, which meant that piston cylinders, rods, heads, valve train, bearings, all of that were straight out of a 964 or 993. And we built a new case that we have cast, fully machined. And in this car, we wanted to explore the turbocharged possibility. So Jeff Gamroth and I got together with Chris at TurboCraft and came up with a formula to use 2 GT28R Garrett turbos, some small, fast spooling little turbos, and feed those into some big intercoolers in both corners and just ram as much cool air into this thing as possible. The engine's 2.4 liter, pretty mild cam, twin plug, produces just under 400 horsepower and super torquey, not a ton of turbo lag. The throttle response is great. It's just like the perfect little combination for this thing. I mean, to have a car that's 1,950 pounds with 255 tires on the back and a good suspension and good hookup and nearly 400 horsepower is just, yeah.
Could we take the bonnet off and see what's
Sure thing.
in the trunk compartment, essentially?
A 356 in standard configuration has an 11-gallon tank, which obviously is not enough. We'd burn through that in no time at all. Fuel Safe, we get together with them and build a 20-gallon fuel cell. And then we use a drop-in fuel system from Radium, which is an Oregon company. They make this awesome little, drop-in set that has 2 pumps. So you've got your main pump and a backup pump. Then you've got your lift pump over here. Your swirl pot is built into here, but it's a complete self-contained unit that essentially just minimizes the effort of doing, a fuel injection fuel system. And then we do a tremendous amount of work with the guys over at XRP, oil lines and oil fittings, because when you're doing this type of stuff, you need low profile fittings. You want to have good crimped style fittings, not reusable type stuff. I mean, we make all of our own lines in-house in the shop. Oil system on the car is a little different story. It's, becomes a little bit more complicated because we're talking about a dry sump system and we want to move as much weight forward as possible. So we built a massive oil tank that sits as far forward as we can get it with, a dash 20, line going all the way back. So we've got a massive oil line going all the way to the back of the engine. And then, this clear vent tube right here goes all the way back to the engine. And, people ask, well, what's that goofy clear tube running all the way back? Well, on the 935s, that's something that Porsche did. For one, you got to have a hose coming forward because you got to, equalize all the pressure between the tank and the engine. But also, that tube is kind of a telltale to give you an idea if you've got, too much foaming going on, if you've got a problem that's occurring. So, you can easily from the driver's compartment just witness that clear tube over to your right-hand side and see if you've got any real issues going on. On the oil system, the other thing that I use, the guys back in Florida, Improved Racing, make just such a really clean and simple oil filter console that also has a thermostat built into it, and then a big Roth Sport Racing front oil cooler in the front. So, the oil system's pretty simple, pretty compact. I think a clean little setup, but well thought out so that we have as few connections as possible, but everything's got good flow and just does its job.
Could we get this thing up on the lift?
Yeah, sure thing.
All right. So now that we're underneath this car, let's start with the suspension, and let's start with this is where the RS comes into this RSR
kind of
build,
equation. Yeah,
right?
so as you can see, it's not your typical 356 suspension. In fact, it's all 964 front suspension, shocks, hubs, or spindles, not hubs, but the hubs themselves are 935. The uprights and front suspension, all that's 964. The way we were able to kind of make all that work, remember we used the center tunnel, the front suspension area, and the rear suspension area and engine compartment out of a 964, and we merged that into a 356. So that then gave us the ability to directly bolt 964 suspension right into the car on factory pickup points. We did change all of the bushings and stuff to spherical balls and KW suspension. So if you take a look up here, we've got KW coilover shocks with the lift capability, so it lifts at approximately 1.5 inches to get this thing in and out of driveways and gas stations and whatnot. And then the brakes, we ended up using stock size 964 calipers. This thing weighs 1,000 pounds less than a 964, so having 964 calipers on it's like having big brakes on the car. But we did have to build special rotors and hats to accommodate the 935 hubs. So I actually had Coleman Racing make those for me, which is the same company that builds a lot of the rotors and hats for guys that are racing 935s and some of the other race cars anyways. Anytime you got to have kind of a custom hat and rotor configuration. Up front, we use the 964 RS type steering rack, so non-power steering rack. The whole shifter setup, so this shift rod is different length than a 964 because we've shortened the chassis or wheelbase on the car slightly from a traditional 964. So the linkage is actually stock 964 linkage from the shift lever back to the transmission, but this rod has to be shortened because we shortened the front part of the chassis. G50-03 transmission, which is a 964 based G50 transmission.
5-speed?
Yeah, this is a 5-speed. Yep. And you can see here a little bit clearer view of some of the engine components. Again, if this was the 6-cylinder version, the valve cover would be longer, there'd be 3 plugs on each side. But our engine case, as you can see, exactly the same architecture and configuration as a 964 case. The only difference is we're 6 inches shorter because normally this would be a 6-cylinder. Now it's only a 4-cylinder, so it uses 4 cylinders, 4 heads, just 2/3 of what normally a 911 would have. Unfortunately, you can't give Jeff a call and say, hey, sell me one of those engines because they're not for sale.
This is only for Emory.
That's right, that's right. Too much blood, sweat, and tears and development went into it.
Well, I don't know. There's not much more to be said about this. This thing was insane. I can't wait to see what you're building even next. I can't wait to see the next iteration of that. With that said, thank you very much, Rod. Can I get a high five?
Right on, man. Thanks for having me.
All right. Super cool. Would you ever do a Honda build for someone?
Yeah, as long as it was a three-wheeler.
Honda ATV from Emory, I guess I'd take it.